What if the very things you were told made you too much were never flaws, but hidden evidence that you were carrying something rare? What if your sensitivity, your intensity, your refusal to shrink were not defects of character, but signs that your soul was growing beyond the limits the world tried to place on you? Most people spend their lives trimming their edges to fit into rooms that were never built for their size. They learn to soften their voice, to tame their vision, to swallow their emotions just to keep the peace. But Carl Jung taught us that the soul does not shrink for long. The psyche always pushes for wholeness, and so what looks like too sensitive is really a deeper attunement. What seems like too intense is actually the force of a differentiated consciousness pressing to be born. Of course, this path does not come without cost. Loneliness arrives when few can meet you where you are. Misunderstanding shadows you because you see differently. And yet, beneath this ache lives a truth that cannot be erased. You are not collapsing, you are expanding. Every tear, every silence, every rejection is shaping the edges of your real self. The moment you stop asking for permission to exist, something shifts. You no longer beg the world to translate you. You begin choosing yourself, even when no one else applauds. That choice is the threshold. From here, life begins to sound different. Feelings that once seemed like noise start arranging themselves into a kind of music, a rhythm, a design, a hidden order that reveals you were never broken, only becoming. And the first sign of this hidden design is simple yet profound. You feel everything, but you do not shatter. What if your ability to sense pain, tension, or energy in a room before anyone speaks is not a weakness, but a form of intelligence that modern life has no language for? Have you ever wondered why you can sit in silence and still feel the emotions of others pressing into you like invisible waves? The truth is, feeling everything doesn't mean you're fragile. It means you're alive in a way most people have forgotten how to be. You're not breaking down, you're breaking open. Let's speak honestly. Many people who carry this kind of sensitivity have learned to suppress it. You were likely told you were too emotional, too dramatic, or too much as a child. So you tried to dull the volume of your inner world to survive in one that rewards detachment. You numbed your own intuition to avoid being labeled unstable. But the cost was steep. Chronic anxiety, internal confusion, emotional exhaustion. Because trying not to feel is like trying to hold your breath for a lifetime. Eventually, your body starts to whisper what the soul has been screaming. You are not broken, you are overloaded. This is where the deeper truth begins. The emotional intensity you carry is not chaos. It is an inner orchestra. And when you learn to listen to it, not fear it, it doesn't shatter you, it guides you. You feel the subtle shift in someone's tone that others miss. You sense when something is off long before it becomes visible. You pick up sadness that hasn't yet been spoken. This is precision, not pathology. It is the gift of finely tuned perception. But without boundaries, this gift becomes a curse. You start to believe that every storm you feel must be your own. You absorb others' despair and call it your failure. You try to fix what was never yours to heal. That's not empathy, it's entanglement. The practice, then, is not to feel less. It's to discern what is truly yours to feel and what is simply passing through. Like a conductor of a great symphony, you must learn when to let the music rise and when to let it fade. This is the difference between emotional overwhelm and emotional wisdom. And here's the sacred question this awakens. What would it mean to trust your sensitivity as a compass, not a cross to bear? When you begin to set boundaries, not walls, but honest, self-honoring limits, you stop drowning in every current. You begin to recognize that your ability to feel is not something you have to hide or dilute. It's something you refine. The moment you claim this, everything shifts. You no longer collapse under the weight of emotions. You move through them like someone who knows how to swim in deep waters. So, if you've ever been told you feel too much, remember, maybe the world feels too little. Your depth is not dysfunction, it's design. And your healing does not lie in shutting yourself down, but in learning how to live with your eyes open, your heart intact, and your energy protected. Because the most powerful souls are not those who feel nothing. They are those who feel everything and choose not to let it destroy them. Have you ever asked a question so piercing, so uncomfortably true, that the entire room went silent, and yet you couldn't unask it? Not because you wanted to stir chaos, but because your soul was done pretending? That silence is not rejection. It is a revelation. And for those wired to evolve, that silence becomes a sacred threshold, the moment your voice reclaims its original purpose, truth. You've likely been in a situation where everything seemed fine on the surface, but your intuition screamed otherwise. At dinner with family, you noticed how your mother avoided talking about your father's emotional absence for years. Everyone danced around it with polite smiles, but you couldn't. You asked, gently but unflinchingly, "Why do we never talk about what really hurt us?" And just like that, something cracked. The illusion of harmony collapsed, but so did the silence that kept everyone stuck. You were not being difficult, you were being real. That moment may have cost you comfort, it may have even fractured relationships, but what you gained was your own alignment. Your soul stopped shape-shifting to survive. In love, this trait is even more exiled. You've probably been in a relationship where you felt something was off. The tone was loving, but the energy didn't match. Words said, "I'm here," but the body, the eyes, the patterns said, "I'm halfway gone." You asked the forbidden question, "Do you actually feel safe being emotionally close to me?" Not because you wanted to accuse, but because you sensed the dissonance. You were met with defensiveness, silence, or withdrawal. But you asked anyway. Because pretending felt more violent than the truth, that question was not an attack. It was a lifeline, an invitation to stop performing and start revealing. If they left, it hurt. But at least you stopped lying to yourself. You don't do small talk with the soul. You are the one who questions why people shrink themselves in institutions, in marriages, in cultures that reward obedience more than originality. You are the one who asks in meetings, "What are we actually avoiding here?" And suddenly, people fidget, because the air just got honest. Not everyone will thank you, most won't. But the few who awaken, because you dared to ask, that's who you're doing it for, including the you who once sat quietly, swallowing questions like stones. But this kind of truth-telling is not loud. It is not about dominating others with opinions. It is about surrendering to a deeper integrity inside. Because before you ever ask another person the hard question, you've already asked it of yourself 100 times in the dark. Where am I not being honest with my own life? That is why your words carry weight. They are not clever performances. They are offerings born from fire. You are not chasing conflict. You are summoning clarity. This power to ask the question that shifts trajectories comes with sacred responsibility. You must be anchored in compassion, or your truth becomes another sword. So you learn boundaries. You learn how to hold space rather than force answers. You build an inner sanctuary where your independence doesn't come from withdrawal, but from a fiercely conscious choice to live aligned. To stop editing yourself in exchange for approval, to stop biting your tongue in rooms where your soul is suffocating. And the beautiful paradox is this: the more you honor your truth, the more you attract those who can hold it. You begin to meet people who thank you, not for saving them, but for reflecting back the parts of themselves they had buried. In that sacred mirror, your question becomes a lighthouse. Not loud, not boastful, just quietly radiant. So if your life has felt turbulent because you keep saying the thing no one wants to hear, know this: you are not disrupting peace. You are disrupting the illusion. And that is the beginning of healing. What if solitude is not a sign of emptiness, but the space where your truest self begins to echo back to you? There comes a time in life, often after the second betrayal, the third dismissal, or the final exhaustion of pretending, when silence becomes the most honest companion. You stop performing for the crowd that only claps when you abandon yourself. And you start to wonder, who are you when there is no one to impress, no mask to wear, no need to be liked? This question does not arise from arrogance. It arises from pain, from years of bending your truth to preserve peace that was never yours, from shrinking your power to protect fragile egos, from realizing that in some rooms your presence is only tolerated when it is small. Standing alone, then, is no longer an act of rebellion. It is an act of remembrance. You begin to remember the moments you knew something was off, but stayed. The people who praised your sensitivity then used it to avoid looking at themselves. The times you gave everything and were thanked with silence. And instead of collapsing into bitterness, something more sacred occurs. You begin to see your solitude not as punishment, but as a sanctuary where your energy no longer leaks through holes carved by others' projections, a place where your soul has room to stretch, breathe, and reorient itself not around someone else's validation, but around its own quiet truth. This is not detachment. This is individuation. Carl Jung described it as the process by which a person becomes individual, not divided by roles, expectations, or unconscious identification, but whole. In this space of sacred solitude, you no longer calculate your worth through applause or external proof. You feel when someone's words pull on your energy. You sense when a conversation is not mutual, but a transaction of unconscious need. And you learn, gently, to stop rescuing, to stop being the accidental therapist. You use your intuition not to absorb others, but to discern your path. You begin to choose where your attention flows, what rooms you walk into, and what invitations you lovingly decline. One woman I spoke with said her life changed when she stopped explaining herself to everyone who misunderstood her. I realized I was not meant to be understood by people still at war with their own emotions, she whispered. I was meant to understand myself so deeply that I no longer needed their approval to breathe. That is the power of standing alone on purpose. You do not isolate yourself because you dislike people. You return to yourself because you refuse to betray your own spirit again. And in that space, something astonishing happens. You start attracting people who don't drain your energy, but honor your truth. You become a tuning fork for authenticity, and those still addicted to performance begin to fall away, not because you pushed them, but because your presence now carries a frequency their facade cannot tolerate. Solitude, then, is no longer empty. It is full of you. Have you ever wondered why you always seem to know the truth before anyone says a word, yet feel utterly drained afterward? It is not your imagination. Your intuition is not just sharp, it is surgical. You feel what is not spoken. You detect the subtle crack in someone's smile, the edge in their tone, the vibration behind their words, and you begin to unconsciously regulate the space, smoothing discomfort, absorbing tension, translating the unsaid into safety for others. But no one notices what it costs you. You leave the room empty while everyone else leaves healed. This kind of deep psychic attunement is not a curse. It is a form of wisdom. But like any wisdom, without boundaries, it becomes self-destruction dressed as empathy. It becomes burnout wrapped in virtue. You become the one everyone comes to, but no one asks if you are okay. You listen, absorb, decode, and validate. Yet when you speak, the room goes quiet, as if your depth is too inconvenient to hold. Slowly, your body begins to whisper what your soul has been screaming. You were not made to carry what was never yours. One woman described it this way: I realized that every time I walked into my family's home, I became the emotional thermostat. I read the room, changed my tone, softened the energy, made it all okay, so no one else had to feel discomfort. And I left with headaches, fatigue, and resentment. I wasn't being kind. I was being consumed. This is the shadow side of intuition. When it is unprotected, it becomes martyrdom. But when it is honored, it becomes a compass. The shift begins when you give yourself permission to stop being the healer by default. You set hours when your energy is closed to others. You let the phone ring. You walk away from conversations where you are only the audience, never the speaker. You stop offering medicine to people who are committed to their wounds. You name what drains you and bless it from a distance. And perhaps most radically, you ask for reciprocity. You let others witness you, support you, and if they cannot, you no longer apologize for leaving. This is not selfishness. This is energy hygiene. Carl Jung said, "Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakens." When you stop bleeding for the world, you begin to create within it. Your intuition, once overused as a defense mechanism, becomes a sacred tool for creation. You begin to ask, what do I want to build with this knowing? What beauty can I make with this depth? The moment you protect your sensitivity, you step out of survival and into meaning. Intuition is not just about reading others, it is about reading your own soul and following its instructions. When your energy is no longer scattered in 100 directions, you return to yourself. And from that place of center, your presence no longer dissolves in the room, it transforms it. Do you remember the moment when everything in your life looked successful on the outside, yet felt empty inside, as if you were a guest in your own story? It's a strange kind of suffering, the kind that doesn't scream but simmers, when your calendar is full but your soul feels starved. Many reach this quiet ache in midlife. You built the life you were told would bring joy, the career that pays well, the relationship that looks stable, the house with curated decor, and the weekends booked with the right people. And yet, in the middle of it all, there's a whisper you can no longer ignore. This isn't it. This is the fracture that begins the journey back to meaning. Not the grand, dramatic meaning that the world markets, but the deeply personal one that cannot be performed. It's when you stop chasing numbness through productivity and begin searching for resonance. You start questioning the work that makes you restless, the conversations that feel scripted, the friendships that only exist in memory. What once distracted you now exhausts you. What once made you proud now leaves you hollow. It is not depression, it is the soul awakening from its anesthesia. Choosing meaning is not convenient. It asks you to stop pretending you don't notice what your body already knows. It may mean stepping away from the role that once made you lovable to others, but invisible to yourself. You might begin painting again at midnight when no one's watching. You might leave a job that depletes you to pursue something quieter but alive. You might finally let go of that circle where no one ever truly listens. Each step is terrifying because meaning requires the death of the persona, the mask that earned you approval but cost you authenticity. And when you choose meaning, others feel it. Some are drawn to your quiet clarity. Others may react as if you've betrayed a script they needed you to play. But this is the alchemy. Your courage to live aligned becomes an invitation for others to stop performing too. Your no becomes a mirror to their compromises. Your joy, no longer feigned, disrupts their numbness. And yes, that may lead to goodbyes. Not because you're cruel, but because your presence is no longer a lie they can unconsciously hide behind. Meaning doesn't shout. It hums in the things that make your eyes soften and your nervous system settle. It glows in relationships where you feel seen, not scanned. It sharpens your intuition and strengthens your boundaries. And eventually you realize this painful unraveling was the beginning of your liberation. Because when you choose meaning, you stop living to be impressive and start living to feel real. Have you ever noticed how certain rooms start to feel tighter, not because the space changed, but because you did? There comes a moment in every journey of inner growth when your very presence becomes too large for the dynamics you once tolerated. Not because you're arrogant, not because you expect perfection, but because your soul has outgrown the version of you that kept trying to make everyone else comfortable. You no longer find peace in playing small just to preserve fragile dynamics, and what once felt like home begins to feel like a cage. You may start to realize that you are being subtly asked to dim your insights, to dilute your depth, to laugh at things that don't move your soul anymore. You're invited to remain predictable so others can feel in control. But your growth will not reverse to soothe another's insecurity. And that's the painful beauty of evolving. It disorients the roles you once played. Some people will try to lure you back into your old identity, not because they're cruel, but because your expansion threatens the illusion they've built around you. They don't see your wings. They only feel the absence of your old self. This shift doesn't always look dramatic. It's the quiet refusal to over-explain, the calm way you leave when conversations turn performative. It's walking out of circles where truth is treated like a threat and authenticity is punished by silence. And when you no longer carry the weight of managing others' discomfort, you start to feel something radical: space. Space to think, to feel, to hear your own rhythm again. In that space, something new begins to breathe. This is not about abandoning people. It's about not abandoning yourself. Your growth is not aggression. Your silence is not withdrawal. It is a sacred recalibration. When you no longer shrink to fit, you become a mirror for others' unclaimed potential. You may lose invitations to familiar tables, but you begin to sit at a deeper one, where your presence is not a threat, but a gift. Take, for example, a woman who spent years saying yes to gatherings that drained her, laughing at jokes that left her empty. One day, without anger, she simply stopped showing up. She took long walks alone, began painting again, reclaimed her mornings. Her energy didn't vanish. It reassembled. Now, instead of pleasing crowds, she inspires them. And the people who once required her to stay small either grew or faded. That is the quiet power of not shrinking. When you walk out of the version of yourself that once fit into others' expectations, something ancient stirs. You become aligned not with roles, but with rhythm, not with approval, but with truth. This is the beginning of soulful maturity. The call you hear is not to rebel, it's to return. To the self that existed before you learned to contort. To the truth that doesn't require permission. Walk out. The door was never locked. Have you ever wondered why your presence alone seems to bring comfort to others, yet leaves you quietly drained when you return to yourself? This paradox is at the heart of many who carry light. Those who naturally hold space, intuitively sense others' needs, and become emotional anchors in relationships, families, or even workplaces. But somewhere in the silent exchange, they begin to disappear. Their radiance is welcomed but rarely reciprocated, and over time, giving without boundaries becomes a slow erosion of the self. Let's speak honestly. Many people who overgive aren't doing it because they're endlessly selfless. They're doing it because they once believed their worth depended on it. As children, maybe love came with conditions, maybe peace only followed compliance. So they became helpful, available, attentive, believing that if they stayed useful, they'd stay safe. But this survival tactic, once so necessary, becomes a spiritual cage in adulthood. Every smile they extend while silently collapsing becomes a quiet plea for someone to see them beyond what they provide. Healing begins when you realize that your empathy is not a currency to earn belonging. You are not here to be consumed. You are here to be expressed. And there's a vital difference. When you show up honestly, not to fix, not to please, but to exist, you begin to reclaim your presence. A healed presence does not need to prove itself through exhaustion. It speaks through quiet clarity. It listens without absorbing. It connects without merging. And that kind of presence does something remarkable. It heals others without losing itself in the process. Consider this. A mature tree offers shade, but it does not uproot itself to chase the sun for others. A river nourishes the land it passes through, but it does not apologize for the direction it flows. In the same way, your light is most powerful when it flows from alignment, not obligation. You are not here to be endlessly accessible. You are here to be sovereign. And sovereignty is not cold or distant. It is simply rooted, boundaried, authentic. There comes a moment in every awakening when the gift of empathy transforms from a wound into a way. You stop chasing the approval of the unready. You stop shrinking around those who resent your glow. And you start living from your creative essence, not for applause, but because it's the only language your soul understands. That's when your presence shifts. It no longer begs to be received. It simply radiates. And in that radiance, something holy happens. Others are healed not by your sacrifice, but by your example. This is the final responsibility of the awakened empath, not to save everyone, but to save themselves first. From that place, everything they touch changes, not because they lost themselves trying, but because they finally remembered who they are. What if the very things you were once shamed for, your depth, your intensity, your emotional precision, were never flaws, but the first signals of a calling that the world simply didn't know how to receive? For the empath, the intuitive, the deeply aware, life often begins as a series of misinterpretations. You were too much, too sensitive, too different. But as the inner work unfolds, a hidden truth is slowly revealed. What others called too much was just the unopened blueprint of your full self waiting for activation. This journey, through masks and mirrors, boundaries and burnouts, solitude and sovereignty, has not been about becoming someone new. It has been about unbecoming everything you had to be in order to be tolerated. Along the way, you faced your shadow. You dared to sit with what the world told you to hide. And in that brave confrontation, you stopped turning your gifts into prisons. You began to see with clarity that discernment is not judgment. It is self-preservation. It is wisdom earned by not only surviving the unconscious, but also integrating it. You now know that not everyone deserves access to your presence. Some people will try to own your light because they do not yet know how to kindle their own. Others will try to dim it because its radiance reveals what they've refused to see in themselves. And a few, just a rare few, will meet you at eye level without envy or fear because they too have walked the spiral path inward and outward. These are your resonant connections. These are the ones who will not flinch when your truth arrives fully formed. To live at the full size of your soul is not a posture of ego. It is the natural state of one who has stopped editing themselves to fit the comfort zones of the half-awake. You do not need to be understood by everyone. You need to understand by yourself. And that begins by naming the call that has always stirred beneath the noise, to live aligned, to love freely, to speak truthfully, and to express your essence without apology. So now, the old script fades. The story that began with, "You are not too much," ends with a final, liberating truth. Too much was only a placeholder for your real dimensions, and those dimensions were never meant to be hidden. They were meant to be lived fully and unapologetically in the presence of those who recognize the sacred weight of your becoming. Now, step into it. The call has a name, and it's yours. If this touched something sacred inside you, don't let it fade into silence. Like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Your presence here is not just support, it's resonance. And if you feel moved to give back, your donation becomes a quiet but powerful gesture that helps keep this light alive for others still walking in the dark.